Ants are cool. They're strong, organised, and they trek almost as far as an average human daily. So I thought I might as well put them against each other in a battle to the death by making a game where you can manage and build a nest and fend off other ants. Now the first thing we're going to want to start with is the ants. Now making an ant should be pretty straightforward. We just need a head and then a body, give it a little bum, and then we give it its little antennas, and then legs. 6 legs. So then we're just going to chuck on its little legs. Just like that, we have a tiny little ant. Now to represent the hive, I'm just going to do a big brown splodge, because obviously it's just a hole in the ground. Now the first step for the actual mechanics is to get this tiny little ant to keep on spawning on this hive. So I'm just going to make a simple button. Now when we press this button, it will trigger this block of code, which will create a clone of the ant sprite. And then when it starts to clone, we're going to put it to the same position of the hive. Then it'll start moving, and then it'll also change direction. So now if we press spawn an ant... okay, that's not quite right. Alright, if we try that again, now we have these little ants, and we can just spawn as many as we like. So now I've added if the ants touch the edge, then they'll just bounce back and face towards the middle and start heading that way instead, so that way none of them ever walk off the screen. And I made them a lot smaller as well, because I quite like the idea of like large scale ant wars. So as you can see, I can just spawn loads of ants, and then we'll never lose any of them to the void. But right now they don't actually do anything. But let me ask you, what do ants need to survive? Well, they need food, obviously. So I think I'm going to make some plants. Now these plants are just going to be little green specks, and they're going to spawn randomly across the map, and then we're going to spawn them in at random intervals. But then for every plant that spawns, we're going to make it so that they create a clone of themselves. And now if we switch over the random position to when we spawn in the clones, then that means we can alter the X and the Y when they first spawn in by a random amount. And this means when a plant reproduces, it will have its babies kind of like close to it. So now when I press play, hopefully we'll have all these green plants everywhere, and then they'll start growing. And that's exactly what you can see happening here. And using these methods just ensure that we get a kind of natural looking plant regeneration system. So now we need to make a way for the ants to collect the food. Now for that we're going to make it so the ant just stops moving when it touches a plant object. But to make it look like the ant is actually carrying the plant, we're going to make a new costume. And then we're just going to add a big green splodge. And then we'll make a new variable. Because if this variable is activated, we'll need the ant to go back to the hive. So I added this chunk of code and then altered some of the code over here. So now when I press play, I can spawn a bunch of ants. And then when they collide with a plant, they'll pick it up and transport it back to the hive. And here you can see that working in a bigger hive. Now at the moment, these ants are kind of dumb. They have no organization because they just walk around randomly and then take food back to the hive. So I'm going to work on giving them pheromone. Now in the real world, ants use pheromones to communicate. They're used to indicate danger, they're used to map out paths to food or other ant colonies. So obviously to achieve this hive mind, we're going to have to create pheromones. Alright, so I skipped out a bit of time because the way that I had to add pheromones was pretty complicated. So this is our little pheromone sprite. And basically all it does is go to the ants that are trying to put down pheromones and then creates a clone underneath those ants. So if I spawn a bunch of ants, you'll be able to see that once they get some food, they then release pheromones, which will then lead other ants to the food. And eventually they fade over time, just like real pheromones, so then they're not like following old ghost paths. But right now they can't actually detect pheromones. Now in the real world they use their little antlers to detect pheromones and feel about and see what's around them. Now we're going to use something quite similar, but instead we're going to use 2 little sensors. And then I'm going to create 2 little invisible specks. I'm going to pop that in the middle, so yeah, there it is. And now we're going to have to find a way to make each one of these follow the ant. Now we're going to have to use lists to track the position of each ant. So we're going to have a list for the X position, and then we're going to have a list for the Y position as well. And then when each clone spawns in, we need them to add their position and then forever replace that position with their current position, so it's always updating. But obviously we can't just have them replacing item 1, otherwise that'll only be one item instead of the full list of clones. So I'm going to make a variable I'm going to call it ant ID. I'm going to set it to 0 when green flag is clicked, and then every time it creates a clone, we change ant ID by 1. And then we're going to take that ant ID, and we're going to use that to identify which part of the list we got to replace. So now hopefully when I spawn an ant, it's kind of working. I think I've set this to the wrong one. So if we redo that, spawn a bunch of ants, you'll see they're constantly broadcasting their X position. And then we do the same, but just for the Y position. And as you can see, we now have updating variables for each ant. And then we need to copy this just one more time, and then we're going to make a new list called direction. So now we have a collection of all the variables that we need. They're all updating in real time. And now we can work on making the sensors actually follow the ants. Now to make sure we can properly spawn in the sensors, all we have to do is check if the ant count is bigger than the sensor count. Because if there's more ants than sensors, then obviously we need to create a new clone. And then we'll update the left sensor count. So if I just alter this sprite, in fact let's change the color. Or maybe just up the opacity. There we go, so then we can actually see the sensors and check they're there. Now if I press play, fingers crossed. No. Oh, almost. It's kind of working. It's just one ant behind. So we need to set left sensor count to 1 instead. So now we should have, yeah, look, each ant has a little sensor. And hopefully we can just duplicate that and then basically do the exact same thing. So as you can see, I'll spawn an ant. You can see we now have 2 little sensors. And the reason why we have 2 sensors is that if it detects a pheromone on this side, then it needs to go this way. If it detects it on this side, it needs to go this way. So now we need to add the code that actually makes the sensors impact which way the ants move. So I've made this little block of code. Basically what it does is it checks if it's touching the pheromones. If it is, then it replaces a specific item on sensor pool to 1. But if it's not touching, then it sets it to 0. And then we do the same thing with the left sensor, but just the opposite. So instead we set it to -1, and then we do a check to see if the other one's trying to change the values. Because if that one's trying to change the values, then you don't want it setting it to 0, because otherwise it will cancel each other out. And as you can see, when I press play and they start making some pheromones, you'll see that the numbers on the side here start to change, and that's the pull in that direction. So if it's -1, it'll be to the left. If it's +1, then it'll be to the right. And obviously if it's 0, then it's not detecting anything. So now we just need to alter the ants' movements depending on those variables. So I've been sitting here for a while now, and as you may notice, the ants are actually somewhat following the pheromone. Like, as you can see, they actually follow the path, and then they just kind of leave it randomly, but they follow it most of the way. This is by far probably the coolest simulation I've ever made. And now in the next devlog I can add fighters, and then we can get some enemy AI going. And before you know it, we're gonna have a pretty realistic Ant Wars simulator thing. Before people ask in the comments, yes, I'm still doing the Game Dev Simulator one, it's just this is a little fun side project that I had interest in doing, so don't worry, I will be coming back to that. But yeah, this has been the first devlog for Ant Wars. As you guys know, I recently hosted the second monthly Moo-Off, which is a series of game jams that I host for Scratch games. I'd like to congratulate HanaMouse1 for coming first with their game Deep Space Agent. Now obviously the real winner was Yastobi, but he won last time, so to select a new candidate, we're just gonna skip past him. But links to the game jam and the winner's game is in the description, so if you want to, then check them out. But anyway, I'll see you in the next devlog.